Brothers and sisters do not come with weapons to kill in order to help. The most precious thing that parents have is taken away from them their children. The immediate goal of the abduction of Ukrainian children by the Russians is to reform at the consciousness of our children. The enemy always plays on this feeling of guilt and shame. The kidnappings do not come as a surprise. We know from history many wars in which the enemy behaved in the same way. The occupiers always seized from the working population in order for them to work for the enemy captors. As to the seizure of children, the topic of child abduction is complicated by the fact that there is no single underlying reason. There are several motives for abducting the youth of an invaded or occupied country. Firstly, in a psychoanalytical sense, the adult population as a whole is put into a state of deprivation and, relatively speaking, even into a state of castration. That is, the abduction of another's child is one of the most dominant, yet pitiful and shameful ways of demonstrating one's power over another. When parents have the most precious thing taken away from them, their children, the population of the territory that is occupied, in essence, also becomes a hostage. Thus, adults begin to behave increasingly submissive, becoming more and more subservient over time. This is one of the primary reasons why Russia resorts to kidnapping children. Secondly, the abduction of Ukrainian children by the Russians is to create a sadistic mindset among the aggressor nation's military. Often, military invaders are expected to commit the most immoral and depraved acts in order to prevent these soldiers from returning to a normal, psychological state of human functioning. Today the soldier kills and rapes, yet tomorrow returns to the state of an ordinary person, where he feels guilt, shame, and internal mental self-accusations. In a cruel balancing act, a ruthless army and society must always be kept in a regular state of readiness for brutality. Cruelty is more complex in its functionality than aggression because aggression has its limits, but cruelty sets a higher standard which increases aggression to a point of constant manifestation. As such, people commit the most immoral acts in order to maintain readiness to apply these brutal behaviors. The immediate goal of the abduction of Ukrainian children by the Russians is the indoctrination of our children in order to make them followers of the Russian worldview. There is a universal psychological phenomenon: the younger a child is, the more he needs an adult. When a child is left without an adult, children inevitably perceive it as betrayal, even if there are evident reasons that neither their parents nor the state betrayed them. Unconsciously, this scenario is perceived by children as deliberately committed against them. For example, a child not yet 6 years old, if he or she lives in adverse conditions, malnourished, or lives in dangerous surroundings, may unconsciously perceive this as an intentional act against him or her. When a child is left without parents, any other figure who begins to play the role of a guardian or just an adult in the environment of this child may or may not become an authority figure for him or her, but at a minimum a figure on whom the child orients themselves and on whom they begin to depend upon emotionally, mentally, and physically. Even though an unconscious phenomenon, it sets the tone for Ukrainian children detaching from their biological parents and realigning to new figures, even if treated cruelly. Many would say this is related to the Stockholm Syndrome. Others would state the children feel some sort of guilt for their captivity, as the prior feelings of patriotism have now been replaced by a stigmatization for being Ukrainian. In the end, all of this is aimed at training a group of children to become militarized adults in the future. This is in line with the belief Russia is planning for a protracted war and possibly a subsequent invasion even after this current war ends. In either scenario, they will have plenty of indoctrinated Ukrainian youth at their disposal. This phenomenon during the current war is not a new occurrence. During the takeovers and occupation of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions in 2014 by Russia, young children in these territories were fed Russian anti-Ukrainian propaganda on a daily basis. Now 18-20 in age, this group has now taken up arms against the homeland of their birth. We see that the longer Russia prolongs hostilities and war, the more opportunities and chances they have to impose their narratives on the occupied territories and thus the formation of new soldiers from the Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine. There are people who possess what some would call dual blood because they are genetically, phylogenetically, ontogenetically, and sociogenetically sensitive to two models of behavior and culture. In essence, these groups are bicultural in nature. As such, when a child has lived in one system of education and national values for some time, but then switches to another system, the child is shown as being adaptable and sensitive to both systems of values. Even if it is formed into some specific trends, it does not lose its sensitivity to other trends. Such a child can become a universal soldier and thus a prime motive for Russia to prolong the war. The longer it is, the higher the probability that Ukrainian-born children will develop into new soldiers for Russia. As such, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children can be undeniably confirmed to be a purposeful state policy of the Russian government and its leaders. Ukraine is a country that has been perpetually at war for centuries due primarily to Russian aggression. Whether it be under the guise of imperialism, communism, or some other political or social context. For 70 years, we were brought up in the Soviet narrative, whereby there was a constant appeal that you cannot surrender or be captured by the enemy. It is better to kill yourself first, as you do not have the personal right to surrender. Only the state has that right. In past history, the returnees from German captivity or other countries hostile to the Soviet Union and Ukraine were likely to be shot. Hence, we are raised on the narrative that in times of war we must be heroes, we must be indomitable, and we definitely have no right to surrender or be captured. The latter is highly stigmatized by our culture in both Soviet and post-Soviet times. As a result, parents may feel guilty that they, in the present day, did nothing and/or did not resist as their children were taken away. The ultimate moral dilemma presents itself as parents do not know what is best to do to save the child's life. Indeed, would any other parent in the world know what to do in this situation? Life, honor, and dignity are the essence of each and every one of us. Life, of course, is the primary element, since without it, the other two do not exist. Yet, the latter two are highly important in how we define ourselves. And in times of war, when they become compromised, a wave of distress, guilt, and shame follows. The enemy knows this. Their standard playbook is to always instill guilt and shame in their captors in order to maintain a presence of dominance. Of course, immediate rehabilitation is needed. A child, after abduction and captivity, can be returned to a certain degree of normalcy over time. But we all understand that the child will never be the same as before the war due to their capture and abduction. All psychological techniques that Russia employs in captivity are based on dictates of power, demonstrations of strength, extracting one's personality, subjugation, and breaking one's spirit. After such a psychological impact, the child in captivity is offered a new option, a new scenario of behavior and life in order to avoid punishment or a more severe consequence. We know a certain part of what happens to kidnapped Ukrainian children in captivity and can only guess the rest as Russian captors employ their cruel games. This is the Russian tradition of training everyone everywhere, a cheap gingerbread dopamine and a terribly painful whip. Prior to the full-scale invasion, as Russia was building up troops on our borders, there were a lot of romantics in Ukraine, even among politicians, who said that nothing would happen. All normal people with common sense, however, understood that if numerous tanks and heavy weapons suddenly amassed along one's borders, something horrendous was likely to be set into motion. Moreover, for such a large deployment of troops and weaponry costing millions of dollars, common sense suggests that this redeployment was not just for show. Likewise, Russian administrative policies are quite the criminal enterprise. All the occupied territories are run by Russian transplants or Ukrainian puppets of the Russian government. Moral values are non-existent as the abduction of Ukrainian children continues to be unceasing. It is obvious for the world to see that Russian state authorities are purposely practicing cruel and inhumane practices under the cover of an illegal invasion. As for Ukraine itself, the consequences will be that we inevitably face a process of collective mourning in the psychoanalytical sense. A certain part of the children abducted by Russia, unfortunately, will never be returned to us, and therefore for us it is a loss, a literal loss, a living loss, a concrete moral loss, because we can feel the collective guilt for not saving our children. It is especially a difficult fate for parents who remained in Ukraine, or will be returned to Ukraine from the occupied territories with little or no contact with their children. The weight of moral and psychological traumatization will be a never-ending nightmare. As for Russia itself, until the moment Russia loses, we cannot predict and say what will happen to it, as the kidnapping of Ukrainian children is another tool of overbearing influence on us. The world will be the final arbiter when this war comes to a halt, and the invaders should be judged harshly and punished to the highest degree. As history has shown, foreign partners and allies are often slow to get involved in international matters, especially wars. The global broadcast of the tragedies and war crimes being committed upon innocent civilians had the world take note. They could no longer stay out of it. And now, with the knowledge of Russians' policy of abducting Ukrainian children, the world must now double its efforts to come to the aid of Ukraine. A new wave of economic sanctions must be imposed on Russia, and added efforts to communicate to all the BRICS countries, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, to use their economic clout over Russia to put an end to this barbaric war, and by extension having all Ukrainian children be returned to their rightful parents. The West and the rest of the world must rally to put a stop to the misery imposed on the innocent. On a personal level, I possess much anger and hatred towards Russia. For centuries, we have lived side by side, sharing a parallel history, a similar culture, and even common bloodlines and genetics. But then on the night of February 24, 2022, that country that often insists we are brothers and sisters invaded us, in the dubious cause of saving us. Only in Russia can they believe they can help a neighbor by torturing and killing them. What was once a friend of ours is now only a common terrorist. The feeling of brotherhood or sisterhood is now a thing of the past and not likely to reappear for decades or centuries to come, or maybe even never.